Okay, today we're going to be talking about living things in their environment. And one of the first things that we're going to be talking about is their habitats. Okay, so the first thing you're going to need to know is an organism is one type of living thing. Okay, so an organism is one type of living thing. So an organism is one type of living thing. And a habitat is an environment that provides the things that organisms need to live, grow, and reproduce. Okay, so you need to know that a habitat is an environment that provides the things that organisms need to live, grow, reproduce. So you should try to say those things in your head so you know that those three factors are important for an organism to live in its habitat. It has to be able to allow the organism to live, grow, reproduce. Live, grow, reproduce. You should keep that in your head and know those three things that habitat allows the organisms to do. An example of an organism would be a prairie dog. And in our science book, it loves the prairie dog. They use that as an example for everything. So you're going to see that a lot throughout this unit. So here's our prairie dog. Now, the prairie dog obtains the food and shelter it needs from its habitat, and it couldn't survive in a tropical rainforest or on the rocky ocean shore. That's not its habitat. It would not be able to live, grow, and reproduce there. So likewise, the prairie would not meet the needs of a spider monkey, whose habitat is the tropical rainforest. And here we have our spider monkey over here. Spider monkey would not be able to live, grow, or reproduce on the prairie because its habitat is the tropical rainforest. Or even a hermit crab, whose habitat is the rocky ocean shore. That hermit crab would not be able to live, grow, and reproduce on the prairie. So the habitats are very specific to those organisms and allows them to live, grow, and reproduce. That's why the Columbus Zoo, which is one of the best zoos in the country, it tries to recreate the natural habitats for the animals there at the zoo so that they can live, grow healthfully, and then reproduce. For example, the polar frontier at the Columbus Zoo, of course, is not going to be exactly like the North Pole, but they're going to try their best to recreate those conditions. So there is a place for the polar bears to go swim and catch fish. There's big rocks so they can lay on them and sun themselves. And they also have some caves that they can go in and take shelter from any of the really hot summer sun or the heat that they're not quite used to. And those caves are air conditioned for them. So that way, if it's getting too warm for them, so they can take shelter from there and be cooled off in the summer. So that way they're still able to live, grow, and reproduce within that recreated habitat at the zoo. Now let's move on to biotic factors. Now an organism interacts with both its living and non-living factors of its habitat. Now the living parts of its habitat are called biotic factors. Okay, now bio, anytime you see bio as a prefix, you know that that means life. Okay, like a biography, it's a story of somebody's life. Or maybe biology. Biology is the study of life. So when you see bio, you know that means life. Here are some examples of biotic factors, like animals. You can say plants. Let's say grass. But yes, that will be included as a plant. Some kids get confused because grass dies or it's in dirt. But yes, grass is a plant. Also, you have bacteria. And worms, just to make sure that you know that because they're in dirt, but worms, that's a biotic factor. And then also if you want to add on there, fungi. like mushrooms. Okay, fungi. So those are all biotic factors. Now it's important that you know that biotic means living, like it has the capability to live. Even if it has died, it still had the capability to live at one point. So for example, the fallen leaf, well, you think, well, it's dead, but it's still a biotic factor because at one point it was able to have lived. So that's what you want to use to determine, is it biotic or abiotic. It's biotic if it's living or if it's had the capability to have ever lived. So let's go on to abiotic factors. Okay. And abiotic factors, oops, abiotic factors are non-living parts of the organism's habitat. Okay, so A, the prefix A, means non or not. So anytime you see A, like abiotic, you know A means non, bio means life, so non-living would make sense if you try to dissect that word part by part. Okay, so anytime you see A, you know that that means not or non. Abiotic factors include, there are about a list of 5 that you should know. So abiotic factors include water, okay, and that can be abbreviated with H2O. Okay, all living things require water to carry out their life processes. So for them to be able to live, they have to have water. Plants and algae need water along with sunlight and carbon dioxide to make their own food in a process called photosynthesis. And other living things depend on plants and algae for food. So other living things depend on plants and algae for food. So if you didn't have plants and algae, if you didn't have the water for them to be able to go through photosynthesis and make their own food, plants and algae wouldn't be able to grow. So what happens to those animals that eat plants and algae? Well, they die. We think, oh, well, I don't eat just plants and algae, so I'll be okay. Well, would you be okay? Well, let's take, for example, somebody who thinks that they eat mostly just meat. Okay, maybe they have steaks every day and they think they'll be okay because they don't really like to eat plants and algae. Well, if you eat steak every day or hamburger every day, then where do you think that comes from? That comes from a cow. Now, a cow eats mostly plants, grass, corn, those are all plants. So whenever the plants aren't there for the cows to eat, okay, and we know that the cows then will die. And if you don't have any cows left, then what will you eat? Uh-oh, that's a problem because then you're not going to have any food to eat. So it is very important that we have those abiotic factors like water and also sunlight that we'll talk about in a moment for photosynthesis. So that way we have those plants and algae that allow organisms to live. So like I said a little bit ago, sunlight is also important as an abiotic factor. Okay, because sunlight is needed for photosynthesis. It is an important abiotic factor for most living things. So in places that don't receive sunlight, like in caves, plants and algae can't grow there. And because there are no plants and algae, few organisms can survive in those places. So few organisms can survive in those places because there's not a food source. Okay, the next abiotic factor is oxygen. And most living things require oxygen to carry out their life processes as well. So organisms that live on land obtain oxygen from air, and the air is 20% oxygen. So you might think that you're just breathing pure oxygen, but you're not, okay? When you just breathe in air, you're filtering out the oxygen that your body needs, and air is only 20% oxygen. And we'll talk about that later this year when we discuss the atmosphere. Now, fish and other water organisms obtain oxygen that is dissolved in the water around them. And that's how they get their oxygen. The next abiotic factor is temperature. Okay, so the temperatures that are typical to an area determine the types of organisms that can live there. When we study biomes starting in December, you're going to see, oh, there's the biome is classified based on its temperature and also how much precipitation it gets, its climate. So there's certain animals that live in those different biomes that you'll study. Now, some animals are able to alter their environments or change. So alter means change. So they can survive very hot or very cold temperatures. So for example, if you look over on our picture here, the prairie dogs can dig underground dens to find shelter from the hot summer sun, because on the prairie, there's not enough water for trees to grow. And that means if there's not enough rain for trees to grow, there's not going to be any shade. And so it's going to be very hot during the summertime. And so the prairie dogs need to be able to survive that heat, and they have adapted behaviorally and started to dig these underground dens to protect themselves from the hot summer sun. Also in the winter, again, because you don't have trees, then you don't have the trees to break the cold winter wind. And so in the winter, they use those caves and those dens to protect them from the cold winter winds. So they're able to adapt behaviorally and what they do to be able to survive the very hot or very cold temperatures. And the last abiotic factor is soil. Now, soil is a mixture of rock fragments, nutrients, air, water, and the decaying remains of living things. So that's what makes up soil. Now, the type of soil in an area influences what kind of plants can grow there. So for example, Pickaway County has a little bit more of a drier, rockier soil than the clay-based soil that's in Ross County. So even though they're very close together, there's different soils, and there are some plants that will grow better in Pickaway County versus Ross County and vice versa. And there's many animals that call the soil its home. So there's many animals that use the soil itself as a home. And billions of microscopic organisms, such as bacteria, also live in the soil. So if you took a sample of soil and put it under the microscope, you'd be surprised to see all of the millions and billions of bacteria that are alive in the soil. And you might not think that whenever you have dirt on your hands, but you have bacteria that are also covering your hands. So it's very important that you keep washing your hands, because there are things there that you don't see to the naked eye. But if you put it under the microscope, you would be surprised. Now let's go on and talk about levels of organization. Now, a species is a group of organisms that are physically similar, so they look alike physically, and they can mate with each other and produce offspring. Okay, so offspring is a fancy word for babies. So if you don't know what offspring means, right, babies, okay? They're able to produce offspring that can also mate and reproduce. Okay, so all members of one species in a particular area are referred to as a population. So for example, all the pigeons in New York City can make up a population because they are all one species and they all live in a specific area. Also, all the bees that live in a hive can also make up a population. All of the people that live in Circleville make up a population because you're all the same species and you're all within a particular area. So that makes up a population. But all the trees in a forest do not make up a population because they do not all belong to the same species. Because in a forest, there may be different species like pines, maple, or birches, or many other tree species that are in that same forest. So unless it's like a Christmas tree farm, which might have all pine trees or all fir trees, then that's not going to be considered a population because there are many different species that are within a certain area. Now, all the different populations that live together in an area make up what's called a community. Okay, this is when a particular area contains more than one species of an organism. And the different populations must live close enough to interact in order to be considered a community. So one way the populations in a community interact is by using the same resources. So when we say resources, we're talking about maybe they're using the same food sources or the same shelter. Okay, so for example, when you're talking about a community where you have two different populations that are interacting together, last fall I was with my daughter at the zoo, and we saw in the North American exhibit there was bison and pronghorns, and pronghorns kind of look like deer. So if you're trying to think about what these things look like, pronghorns kind of resemble deer, but they have some horns. Um, Now the bison and pronghorns, they live in that same exhibit, okay? But you have a population of pronghorns, okay? They're all one species altogether, so that makes up a population of pronghorns. Then there's all one species of bison. That makes up a population of bison. Now, those two populations are interacting together. And when we were at the zoo, we saw that they were fighting over maybe their same food, or maybe it was the shelter that they were trying to share. But one pronghorn had really made one of the bison in that exhibit very mad at him. So we saw that pronghorn was running all over the exhibit, and here comes the big old bison that was chasing after that pronghorn and like trying to like butt its head and trying to hit that pronghorn. And so we knew, uh-oh, they're not getting along very well. So they're interacting, right? They're interacting with each other. And we went around the other exhibits, and then when we came back around, we saw that, oh, well, one of the bison was just laying there then under the tree, and then there was one pronghorn not too far away that then had a big gouged out place in his side. So apparently that bison did closely interact with that pronghorn and had injured it. So they were able to interact within that community, and apparently they got upset because they were probably competing for the same resources, so some type of food or shelter, and the bison didn't care for that at that particular day. So that's an example of two populations that make up a community. Now, the community of organisms that live in a particular area, along with their non-living, their abiotic surroundings, so they're non-living, and we know that that means abiotic surroundings, that makes up an ecosystem. Okay, so we know that, you can write it over here, community plus abiotic, write it like a math problem, equals ecosystem. Okay, so community plus abiotic equals an ecosystem. Okay, so let's take a look at our pyramid. And let's see how these things build up. And we start off at the top of the pyramid. You have an organism because the top of the pyramid is the smallest part. So an organism, you might say, an example would be one prairie dog. Okay. Now a population example would be many prairie dogs. So you have the same organism, but many of them. Okay, so many prairie dogs. Okay, now a community, you have different populations that are all interacting together, like our pronghorn and bison example. So for this example, you might have prairie dogs. You might have hawks. You might have prairie fowl, that's a bird. You might have snakes, okay, and other biotic factors that are included in there. Now, for your ecosystem, you're going to take all of those things that are in a community and then add in the abiotic factors like sunlight or water or oxygen or soil, and that makes up your ecosystem. So we know that that's community. So when you take all of these things, okay, that makes up your community, plus your abiotic factors like sunlight, oxygen, water, soil, and the temperature, then that makes up your ecosystem. So ecosystem is the biggest term of all of these things. It kind of encompasses everything. So all of the abiotic and the biotic factors come together and make up an ecosystem. Okay, so this is the end of our Living Things in Their Environment notes. If you need to go back and review, feel free to rewind this video. Thank you for listening.